The most powerful man in the ballroom stopped speaking the moment he saw her wrist. The sentence would be repeated for months by people who attended the Whitmore Foundation Gala, but on that night, nobody understood why. The Grand Regency Ballroom shimmered beneath towering crystal chandeliers, their golden light reflecting across polished marble floors and rows of elegantly dressed guests. Soft classical music drifted through the air. Champagne glasses sparkled. Conversations flowed between politicians, investors, celebrities, and executives who measured success in numbers most people could barely imagine. It was the kind of room where power seemed permanent. Naomi Carter moved quietly through the crowd, carrying a silver tray filled with sparkling water and wine. At 26 years old, she had worked dozens of events like this one. She knew how to remain invisible when necessary. Wealthy guests rarely remembered the people serving them. Naomi did not take it personally. She focused on doing her job well, earning honest money, and helping support her grandmother, who had raised her since childhood. Dressed in a crisp white shirt, black vest, and neatly pressed apron, she navigated the ballroom with calm professionalism. Most guests never looked directly at her. That was normal. Tonight felt no different. At least not at first. Across the room stood Ethan Whitmore, the billionaire founder of Whitmore Capital. At 39 years old, Ethan was known for making decisions that could move markets and reshape companies. Financial magazines called him brilliant. Competitors called him relentless. Employees described him as disciplined, demanding, and impossible to impress. He rarely attended social events longer than necessary. Yet tonight he remained near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by donors and business leaders discussing the foundation's newest educational initiatives. Everything appeared routine. Then Naomi approached the group carrying a fresh tray of drinks. She paused beside the gathering and politely offered refreshments. Most guests accepted without looking at her. Ethan reached for a glass, then suddenly froze. His fingers stopped in midair. The conversation around him continued for another few seconds before several people noticed something unusual. Ethan was staring at Naomi. More specifically, he was staring at the silver bracelet resting on her wrist. The bracelet was old, worn smooth by time. Nothing about it appeared valuable. Naomi had worn it for years because it once belonged to her grandmother. She never imagined anyone would pay attention to it. Yet Ethan's eyes remained fixed on it, as though he had just seen a ghost. The executives around him exchanged confused glances. One donor laughed nervously and attempted to continue the discussion. Ethan did not respond. The room seemed to narrow around a single object. A silver bracelet. Naomi shifted uncomfortably beneath his gaze. For the first time all evening, she felt self-conscious. Finally, Ethan spoke. His voice was calm, but it carried enough authority to silence everyone nearby. "Where did you get that bracelet?" The question caught Naomi completely off guard. "My grandmother gave it to me," she answered honestly. Ethan's expression changed. Not anger, not surprise, something deeper, something almost impossible to identify. The guests standing nearby immediately sensed that something important had happened, though none of them understood what. Ethan looked at the bracelet again, then at Naomi, then back at the bracelet. The music continued playing, but the moment felt strangely disconnected from the rest of the ballroom. Several conversations faded into whispers. People began watching. Human curiosity spreads quickly in rooms filled with influence. Ethan turned toward one of his assistants standing nearby. His next words traveled farther than he intended. "Bring her to me." Silence rippled outward through the crowd. Naomi felt every eye in the room shift toward her. Guests exchanged looks. Some raised their eyebrows. Others whispered behind lifted glasses. Nobody knew why the billionaire CEO wanted to speak with a waitress in the middle of the gala. But nearly everyone assumed the same thing. Whatever happened next, it could not possibly be good. And as Naomi followed the assistant across the ballroom toward the most powerful man in the room, she had no idea that a forgotten piece of family history was about to change both of their lives forever. Naomi Carter had walked through crowded ballrooms before, but she had never felt anything like this. Every step toward Ethan Whitmore seemed to echo louder than the music itself. Conversations softened as she passed. Guests who had ignored her all evening suddenly watched her with open curiosity. Some looked concerned. Others appeared entertained. A few seemed almost disappointed that they might miss whatever drama was about to unfold. Human nature often prefers a scandal to a mystery. Naomi kept her eyes forward and followed the assistant through the sea of expensive suits and designer gowns. The closer she came to Ethan's table, the heavier the attention felt. By the time she arrived, dozens of people had subtly repositioned themselves nearby, pretending to continue conversations while listening to every word. Ethan remained standing. His gaze returned immediately to the bracelet on her wrist. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence itself created tension. Naomi became aware of the crystal chandeliers overhead, the distant sound of a violin, and the hundreds of assumptions being made around her. Most people already believed they understood the situation. Most people were wrong. Ethan finally gestured toward an empty chair. "Please sit down." The request surprised her. It also surprised nearly everyone watching. Several guests exchanged puzzled glances. This was not the confrontation they expected. Naomi hesitated before taking the seat. Ethan remained standing for another moment, studying the bracelet once more. His expression carried something unusual. Not anger, not suspicion, recognition. "How long have you had it?" he asked quietly. Naomi glanced at the bracelet. The silver surface reflected the warm ballroom lights. "Since I was a teenager," she replied. "My grandmother gave it to me." Ethan nodded slowly. The answer seemed important to him. Across the room, whispers multiplied. A wealthy donor near the bar leaned toward her companion and murmured something. Two executives stopped discussing investments entirely. Even members of the event staff occasionally looked in their direction. Naomi could feel the weight of those stares. She wondered what stories people were inventing. Ethan took a slow breath. "Did your grandmother ever tell you where it came from?" Naomi shook her head. "Not really. She only said it had been important to her for a long time." Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. The response seemed to awaken a memory. For several seconds he said nothing. The billionaire who usually controlled every conversation suddenly appeared lost somewhere far away. Naomi found herself studying him differently. Earlier he seemed untouchable, the kind of man whose life existed in a completely different world. Now he looked like someone chasing a memory he could not quite reach. "Is something wrong?" she asked gently. Ethan looked up. The question appeared to catch him off guard. People rarely asked if something was wrong with him. They usually asked what he wanted, what he thought, or what decision he would make next. Concern was unfamiliar territory. "No," he said after a pause. "I am just trying to understand something." The assistant standing nearby remained silent. So did everyone else at the table. The atmosphere felt increasingly strange. Naomi had expected a brief conversation and a return to work. Instead, she found herself at the center of a mystery she did not understand. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. After scrolling through several photographs, he stopped and stared at the screen. His expression changed again. This time Naomi noticed a flicker of emotion that seemed almost impossible to imagine on the face of a man famous for discipline. He enlarged an old photograph and compared it to the bracelet. The similarity was undeniable. Ethan slowly lowered the phone. Around them, the ballroom continued glowing with wealth and celebration, yet neither seemed aware of it anymore. Somewhere in the distance, applause erupted for a speech on the main stage. Neither turned to look. Ethan's attention remained fixed on Naomi and the silver bracelet. Then he asked a question that made her heart skip. "Miss Carter, would you be willing to tell me everything you know about your grandmother?" The room continued whispering. The guests continued speculating. But for the first time that evening, Naomi realized the billionaire was not interested in who she was. He was searching for someone else entirely. For a moment, Naomi Carter simply stared at Ethan Whitmore. The question seemed ordinary on the surface, yet something about it carried unexpected weight. Around them, the gala continued in a haze of golden light and distant conversation, but their table felt strangely isolated from the rest of the ballroom. Naomi glanced down at the bracelet resting on her wrist. She had worn it for years without giving it much thought. Now a billionaire CEO was looking at it as though it held the answer to a mystery that had followed him for decades. "There is not much to tell," she said carefully. "My grandmother never liked talking about herself." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "What is her name?" "Margaret Carter." The moment the name left Naomi's lips, something changed in Ethan's expression. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet Naomi saw it. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second before he looked away. Not because he doubted her answer, because the name clearly meant something. Nearby guests continued pretending not to watch. A group of donors stood near a marble column discussing charity projects while listening to every word. Two executives lingered beside the bar longer than necessary. Curiosity had completely replaced whatever assumptions people originally held. Ethan slowly lowered his gaze toward the photograph still displayed on his phone. It was old. The colors had faded with time. Naomi could not see every detail, but she noticed a younger man standing beside a snow-covered road. Beside him stood a woman whose face was partially hidden by a winter coat and knitted hat. Yet one thing remained unmistakable: a silver bracelet. The same bracelet. Naomi felt a chill run through her. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. Ethan stared at the image for several seconds before answering. "My father." The ballroom noise seemed to fade into the background. Ethan rarely spoke about family in public. Most people knew almost nothing about the man who built the foundation that eventually became the Whitmore fortune. "This picture was taken 23 years ago," Ethan continued. "Long before Whitmore Capital existed." Naomi listened carefully. Something inside her told her this conversation was about to change direction completely. Ethan set the phone on the table between them. "When I was 16, my father told me a story he never forgot." His voice grew quieter, more personal. One winter night during a snowstorm in upstate New York, his truck broke down on a rural highway. There were almost no cars on the road. Temperatures were below freezing. He had no way to call for help. Naomi found herself leaning forward. Around them, the Gala faded even further into the distance. Ethan looked at the photograph again. He always said that night could have ended very differently if a stranger had not stopped. Naomi remained silent. Ethan continued. According to him, a woman driving home from work pulled over, helped him get warm, contacted assistance, and stayed until help arrived. He paused. "When everything was over, my father offered her money." Naomi already suspected how the story ended. Ethan gave a small smile. She refused. The answer did not surprise her. It sounded exactly like something her grandmother would do. Margaret Carter had spent her entire life helping people without expecting recognition. She volunteered at shelters, checked on elderly neighbors, delivered meals when families were struggling. Naomi had seen it since childhood. Kindness seemed as natural to her grandmother as breathing. Ethan's gaze drifted back toward the bracelet. "My father said she wore a silver bracelet with a unique engraving." Naomi looked down immediately. Hidden beneath years of wear, the faint outline of a small engraved flower remained visible along the inside edge. Ethan noticed her reaction. "That is the same symbol." Neither spoke for several seconds. The possibility hanging between them felt too large to process immediately. Then Naomi remembered something. A memory buried deep in childhood. Her grandmother once mentioning a snowstorm, a stranded traveler, a long drive home that ended much later than expected. At the time, Naomi had been too young to pay attention. Now every forgotten detail seemed to return at once. Ethan slowly folded his hands. "For 23 years, my father wondered what happened to the woman who helped him." The music continued playing. Glasses clinked softly somewhere across the ballroom. Yet at that table, surrounded by wealth and influence, two people suddenly found themselves connected by a story neither fully understood. And for the first time that evening, Naomi began to suspect the silver bracelet was not simply a family keepsake. It was a doorway into a past that had been waiting decades to be discovered. The discovery lingered between them long after the conversation should have ended. Around the ballroom, the gala continued with polished speeches, quiet laughter, and the soft music of a string quartet, but neither Naomi Carter nor Ethan Whitmore seemed aware of any of it anymore. The silver bracelet rested quietly on Naomi's wrist, yet it now carried the weight of 23 unanswered years. Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. "My father talked about that woman for the rest of his life," he said softly. Naomi remained silent. Something told her these memories were deeply personal. Ethan rarely shared personal stories with anyone, let alone a waitress he had met less than an hour earlier. Yet tonight felt different. Whenever people asked him how he built his success, he always mentioned hard work, discipline, and opportunity. Ethan continued. But when nobody else was around, he would tell a different story. Naomi listened carefully. Ethan smiled faintly at the memory. He said none of those things would have mattered if a stranger had not stopped her car during a snowstorm. The billionaire's voice carried an unusual warmth now. The sharp edges people associated with him seemed to have disappeared entirely. Across the ballroom, several guests continued watching from a distance. The mystery surrounding the conversation only made them more curious. Yet nobody approached. Something about Ethan's expression made it clear this was no longer a business discussion. It was something far more personal. "Did your father ever find her?" Naomi asked. Ethan shook his head. He tried. His answer came immediately. "For years." Naomi looked surprised. Ethan nodded slowly. He hired investigators, contacted local authorities, even returned to the town where it happened. He paused, but he never learned her name. A strange silence settled between them. Naomi thought about her grandmother sitting at home, probably reading a book in her favorite chair without the slightest idea that a room full of influential people was discussing something she had done more than 2 decades earlier. It sounded exactly like Margaret Carter. She never helped people for recognition. She helped because she believed it was the right thing to do. Ethan reached for his phone again and opened another photograph. This one showed a handwritten letter. The paper looked old and fragile. "My father wrote this 6 months before he passed away." Naomi glanced at the screen. Ethan carefully enlarged a section of the letter. "The woman who saved me never knew what happened afterward," he read quietly. "She never saw the life she helped preserve. I hope someday someone tells her that one act of kindness changed generations she would never meet." Naomi felt a lump form in her throat. The words sounded painfully sincere. Ethan lowered the phone. "I always thought he was being sentimental." He laughed softly. "Now I am not so sure." The music swelled briefly from the main stage before fading once again into the background. The gala suddenly felt less important than the story unfolding at their table. Naomi looked down at the bracelet. "I remember my grandmother mentioning a snowstorm once." Ethan immediately looked up. "You do?" "Only fragments." Naomi searched her memory. "I was maybe 10 years old. She said she got home long after midnight because she stopped to help someone on a road during bad weather." Ethan remained completely still. "Did she ever mention who?" Naomi shook her head. "No. She never talked about it again." The answer somehow made the story even more believable. Margaret Carter had never been the type to turn kindness into a personal achievement. Ethan slowly nodded. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but neither of them had enough proof. Not yet. Then Naomi remembered something else. A small wooden box sitting in her grandmother's bedroom closet. She had seen it for years. Old photographs, letters, mementos from decades ago. Her grandmother rarely opened it. Naomi's eyes widened slightly. "There may be something at home." Ethan leaned forward immediately. "What kind of something?" "I do not know." Naomi answered honestly. "But my grandmother kept old letters and photographs from that period." For the first time all evening, real hope appeared on Ethan's face. Not the confidence of a billionaire. Not the certainty of a CEO. Hope, pure and simple. Somewhere inside that forgotten box might be the answer to a question his father carried for more than 20 years. And as the golden lights of the gala continued shining around them, both Naomi and Ethan realized the past was no longer a distant memory. It was beginning to reach into the present. The gala ended hours later, but Naomi Carter could not stop thinking about the conversation. The city lights blurred past the train window as she traveled home through the cool night. Around her, passengers scrolled through phones, listened to music, or stared quietly into the darkness outside. Naomi barely noticed any of it. Her thoughts remained fixed on a silver bracelet, an old photograph, and a story that suddenly felt far larger than she had ever imagined. By the time she reached the small brick house she shared with her grandmother, the neighborhood was quiet. Porch lights glowed softly along the street. A distant dog barked somewhere in the darkness. Naomi stepped inside and found Margaret Carter asleep in her favorite armchair with a book resting on her lap. The sight immediately calmed her. Some people carried a sense of peace wherever they went. Margaret was one of those people. Naomi smiled gently and covered her grandmother with a blanket before heading toward the hallway. Then she stopped. Her eyes drifted toward the closet door at the end of the hall. The wooden box. For years it had remained tucked away on the top shelf. Important enough to keep. Unimportant enough to leave unopened. At least that was what Naomi always assumed. Tonight felt different. She carefully retrieved the box and carried it to the dining room table. The wood showed signs of age. Small scratches. Worn corners. The marks left behind by decades of ordinary life. Naomi hesitated before lifting the lid. The scent of old paper immediately filled the room. Inside rested photographs, greeting cards, letters, ticket stubs, and small keepsakes collected over a lifetime. Nothing looked extraordinary. Yet somewhere inside could be the answer Ethan Whitmore had spent years searching for. Naomi began sorting carefully through the contents. Most items reflected everyday memories. Family gatherings, church events, birthday celebrations. Then she found something unusual. A faded photograph slipped from between two envelopes and landed on the table. Naomi picked it up slowly. Her heart immediately began racing. The image showed a younger Margaret standing beside a snow-covered roadside. Next to her stood a man Naomi had never seen before. A man wearing a heavy winter coat and smiling toward the camera. Naomi stared at the photograph for several seconds. Then she looked closer. On Margaret's wrist rested the same silver bracelet. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Naomi reached for one of the envelopes beneath the photograph. The paper had yellowed with age. Carefully opening it, she unfolded a handwritten note. The writing was unfamiliar. The date at the top stopped her cold. 23 years earlier. Naomi slowly began reading. Dear Margaret, I hope this letter reaches you. I never properly thank you for what you did that night. Most people would have continued driving. You stopped. Naomi swallowed hard. Every word seemed to pull another piece of the mystery into place. The letter continued describing a snowstorm, a broken vehicle, and gratitude that had clearly never faded. By the time she reached the signature at the bottom, she was no longer breathing normally. The name read simply, Daniel Whitmore, Ethan's father. Naomi lowered the letter onto the table and sat motionless. The proof had been sitting inside this box the entire time, hidden in plain sight. A story that connected two families had waited more than 2 decades to be rediscovered. She glanced toward the living room where her grandmother still slept peacefully, completely unaware of the significance of the documents resting on the table. Naomi looked back at the photograph. Daniel Whitmore appeared younger than the image Ethan had shown her, but there was no doubt. It was the same man, the same winter, the same bracelet, the same story. Then something else caught her attention. Tucked beneath the letter was a second envelope. Unlike the first, it had never been opened. Naomi carefully turned it over. Written across the front in Margaret's handwriting were 6 simple words. To be opened, if ever found. Naomi felt a chill run through her. Whatever waited inside that envelope had been sealed for more than 20 years. And for the first time since leaving the gala, Naomi realized the truth might be even bigger than either she or Ethan had imagined. Naomi Carter stared at the sealed envelope for nearly a full minute before opening it. The house remained silent except for the gentle ticking of the clock above the kitchen doorway. Outside, the neighborhood slept peacefully beneath the night sky. Inside, 23 years of unanswered questions waited inside a single piece of folded paper. Naomi carefully slid her finger beneath the envelope flap. The seal released with a soft crackle. Her heart raced. She unfolded the letter and immediately recognized her grandmother's handwriting. The message was short, far shorter than she expected. Yet every word seemed deliberate. If this letter is ever found, it means life has finally connected 2 stories that were never meant to stay apart. The man from the snowstorm tried to thank me many times. I never accepted because kindness is not a debt. It is a responsibility. If his family ever discovers the truth, tell them I never saved his future. I simply did what anyone should do for another human being. Naomi paused and read the words again. They sounded exactly like Margaret. Simple, humble, honest. But the letter was not finished. Below the final paragraph was something even more surprising. Attached with a paperclip was a newspaper article. The edges had yellowed with age. Naomi carefully unfolded it. The headline immediately caught her attention. The article described a small manufacturing company struggling to survive during difficult economic times. The company owner mentioned in the story was Daniel Whitmore. Naomi read further. According to the article, Daniel rebuilt his business after a series of setbacks and eventually transformed it into a growing regional enterprise. A handwritten note appeared in the margin beside the article. The handwriting belonged to Margaret. I'm glad he made it. That was all she wrote. No claim of responsibility. No mention of her own role. Just quiet happiness that someone else's life improved. Naomi felt emotion rise in her chest. Some people spend their lives searching for recognition. Her grandmother spent hers avoiding it. The next morning sunlight filled the dining room. Margaret sat at the table drinking coffee when Naomi finally showed her the photograph, the letter, and the article. For several moments, the older woman said nothing. She simply stared at the items spread before her. Then she smiled. Not with surprise. With recognition. I wondered if those would ever be found, she said softly. Naomi blinked. You knew? Margaret nodded. Of course. Naomi sat down across from her. Grandma, why did you never tell me? Margaret took a slow sip of coffee before answering. Because it was not the most important part of the story. The answer sounded almost impossible. Naomi gestured toward the photograph. You helped save the father of one of the most successful businessmen in America. Margaret smiled again. No, I helped a cold man during a snowstorm. The distinction mattered to her. Naomi could see it immediately. To Margaret, wealth changed nothing. Status changed nothing. Need was need. Humanity was humanity. The rest was secondary. Naomi spent the next hour listening as her grandmother filled in missing details. The snowstorm. The broken truck. The long wait for assistance. Daniel's repeated attempts to repay her. Every piece matched Ethan's story perfectly. By noon, there was no longer any doubt. The mystery was solved. Two families connected by a single act of kindness had finally found each other again. Later that afternoon, Naomi sent Ethan a message asking if they could meet. The response arrived less than 5 minutes later. Simple. Immediate. Absolutely. As Naomi gathered the photograph, letters, and newspaper article into a folder, she glanced toward her grandmother. Margaret seemed completely unbothered by the significance of the discovery. She simply returned to reading her book. Naomi smiled. Some people become remarkable because they seek greatness. Others become remarkable because they never stop choosing kindness. And somewhere across the city, Ethan Whitmore was about to learn the full truth his father had waited more than 2 decades to uncover. Margaret Carter held the handwritten note with both hands as though it were something fragile and precious. The room remained quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock in the hallway. Sunlight filtered through the living room curtains, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. Ethan Whitmore and Naomi sat nearby, without speaking. Neither wanted to interrupt the moment. Some things deserve silence. Margaret carefully read every line. Then she read it again. When she finally looked up, there were tears in her eyes, but her smile remained warm. That sounds like Daniel, she said softly. Ethan leaned forward. You remembered him? Margaret laughed gently. Of course I remembered him. I just never expected to hear from him again. She glanced down at the note. Some people leave an impression. Ethan nodded. My father never forgot you. The older woman shook her head slowly. I think your father remembered the wrong thing. Ethan looked confused. Margaret noticed immediately. He remembered the help, she explained. What mattered was what he did with it afterward. The words settled quietly into the room. They sounded simple, yet they carried the kind of wisdom that only comes from a life well lived. Over the next hour, Margaret shared stories Naomi had never heard before. Not because they were secrets, simply because she never considered them important. Enough to mention, she spoke about neighbors helping neighbors during difficult winters, about strangers sharing meals during hard times, about people choosing kindness when nobody was watching. To Margaret, the snowstorm was not a defining moment. It was one example among many. Ethan listened carefully. The more he learned, the more he understood why his father admired her so deeply. Before leaving, he made a promise. There is something I would like to do. Margaret smiled knowingly. Daniel tried that too. Ethan laughed. I know. The following month passed quickly. Winter slowly gave way to spring. Trees throughout Chicago began showing signs of new growth. Life continued moving forward. Yet behind the scenes, Ethan worked on a project unlike anything he had launched before. It was not a business acquisition, not an investment strategy, not a corporate expansion. It was personal. One evening, Naomi received an invitation asking her and Margaret to attend a special event hosted by the Whitmore Foundation. Neither knew exactly what to expect. When they arrived, they found themselves standing inside the same ballroom where everything had begun. Crystal chandeliers filled the space with golden light. Elegant guests gathered around beautifully decorated tables. Yet the atmosphere felt different this time. Less formal, more meaningful. Naomi immediately noticed something unusual. Large screens near the stage displayed a photograph she recognized instantly. The snow-covered roadside photograph from the wooden box. Her eyes widened. Margaret looked equally surprised. Guests gradually took their seats. Conversations softened. Then Ethan stepped onto the stage. The room fell silent. He stood beneath the lights for a moment before speaking. 23 years ago, a simple act of kindness changed the future of my family. Hundreds of people listened attentively. Ethan continued telling the story. Not as a businessman, not as a billionaire, as a son. He described the snowstorm, the stranded traveler, the stranger who stopped, the years his father spent searching, the rediscovery of a forgotten connection. As the story unfolded, many guests glanced toward Margaret and Naomi. Some smiled. Others appeared deeply moved. Then Ethan revealed the final surprise. A new scholarship initiative would be created to honor ordinary people whose acts of compassion create extraordinary change. The program would support caregivers, community volunteers, and individuals dedicated to helping others without expecting recognition. The name appeared across the giant screens behind him. The Margaret Carter Legacy Scholarship. The ballroom erupted into applause. Margaret immediately shook her head in disbelief. Naomi laughed through tears. Ethan smiled. My father believed one person's kindness changed generations. Tonight, we make sure that kindness continues changing lives. For several moments, the applause would not stop. Yet the most remarkable part was not the scholarship. It was the realization spreading throughout the room. The woman who once served meals, checked on neighbors, and quietly helped strangers had never sought recognition. And somehow, that was exactly why she deserved it. The applause continued long after Ethan Whitmore stepped away from the podium. Guests remained standing beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, many of them visibly moved by a story that began with a single decision made on a snowy road more than 2 decades earlier. Yet as the evening unfolded, something became increasingly clear. The scholarship was not the true ending of the story. It was the beginning of a new one. Months passed. Applications arrived from across the country. Caregivers, volunteers, teachers, community workers, ordinary people whose acts of kindness rarely made headlines. The Margaret Carter Legacy Scholarship quickly became one of the most respected programs sponsored by the Whitmore Foundation. Not because of the money involved, because of the values it represented. During that time, Naomi Carter continued working and living much as she always had. Friends often asked whether her life felt different now. In some ways it did. In many ways it did not. She still rode the train, still visited her grandmother every evening, still believed that character mattered more than attention. Yet everywhere she went, she carried a deeper appreciation for the unseen ways kindness travels through time. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after the gala, a special ceremony was held to introduce the first scholarship recipients. The event took place in a community center rather than a luxury ballroom. Margaret insisted on that. She believed the focus should remain on the people being helped, not on herself. The room filled with students, families, volunteers, and community leaders. Ethan sat beside Naomi and Margaret in the front row. As recipient after recipient shared their stories, a common theme emerged. Every one of them had been inspired by someone who chose compassion without expecting recognition. A teacher, a neighbor, a parent, a stranger, different faces, different circumstances. The same lesson. During the ceremony, one young recipient stepped to the microphone and said something that silenced the entire room. Most people think changing the world requires something extraordinary, she said. But sometimes it starts with stopping your car for someone who needs help. Margaret lowered her eyes and smiled. Ethan glanced toward Naomi. Neither needed to say a word. They both understood. After the event ended, guests slowly filtered outside into the warm afternoon sunlight. Children played near the entrance. Families took photographs. Volunteers laughed together. It felt less like a formal ceremony and more like a celebration of community. Ethan found himself standing beside Margaret near a garden path lined with blooming flowers. My father would have loved this, he said quietly. Margaret looked toward the crowd. I think he already does. Ethan smiled. For the first time in years, he believed that might be true. Nearby, Naomi watched the scholarship recipients speaking excitedly about their futures. Opportunities existed now because one story had finally found its way home. A story that almost disappeared. A story hidden inside a wooden box. A story carried by a silver bracelet. As the afternoon sun painted long shadows across the garden, Naomi thought about everything that had happened. The gala, the questions, the photographs, the letters, the reunion. None of it began with power or wealth. It began with a choice. A simple choice made by a woman who believed helping another human being was never something special. It was simply the right thing to do. And in the end, that became the lesson everyone remembered. Not the billionaire, not the foundation, not even the scholarship. They remembered that genuine kindness often arrives quietly, asks for nothing in return, and leaves behind a legacy greater than anyone can imagine. Because money can build buildings. Success can build companies. But character builds lives. And on a snowy night long ago, one woman proved that the smallest act of compassion can echo across generations.